My name is Chris Evans. I'm an extension forester here with the University of Illinois, and I'm based in Southern Illinois at the Dixon Springs Agricultural Center. This is an area where we do a lot of forestry research, a lot of demonstration, a lot of teaching. If you're anything like me, you love a good hearty breakfast. And there's nothing better for breakfast than a big stack of hot pancakes with a lot of maple syrup. So we're going to talk about maple syrup, making maple syrup, what it is, and everything today. Maple syrup is an interesting food. It is a one ingredient food. There's only one thing that makes maple syrup, only one thing that goes into making it, and that is the sap from maple trees, just like this one right here. So how do we get the sap? How do you turn it into maple syrup? A lot of neat things. We're going to look at that in this short video today. So what is the sap of a tree? All trees have sap. Basically, it is the transport system in a tree. So trees make energy from their leaves, they get up water and nutrients from their roots, and they have to move this around the tree. And so they do that through the sap. It's liquid. If you look at it here, this is actually some little holes where a woodpecker, called a sapsucker, actually drilled out to get at the sap, and you can see it leaking down this tree. Sap, since it carries energy for trees, that energy is carried in sugar. That's what the tree uses for energy. It makes the sugars. So sap is a sugary liquid that moves up and down the tree. It transports all the energy, the nutrients through the tree. We take that sap that has a little bit of that sugar and we concentrate it into maple syrup. That's the only ingredient. Since it has a little bit of sugar, we get the water off and it makes it thicker and sweeter and thicker and sweeter until it turns into maple syrup. We have to collect the sap. We have to then get rid of the water, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But just know that most trees make sap, but maple sap is very sweet. It tastes good, and that's the ones that we use to make syrup with. So how do you get this sap out of the tree before you can turn it into maple syrup? You do that through a process we call tapping a tree. And that simply means you make a little hole in the tree, just kind of like the woodpecker, the sapsucker did over there. You make a little hole in the tree and then you put a spile, that's what this is, and right here too, and that spile just collects the sap and pulls it down as the sap drains out into these tubes. You may have seen those old videos or old pictures of people using buckets and the sap drips in the bucket. You can do that. We use little tubes like this, but you take it out of the tree through little tiny holes. Once you pull those spiles out, the tree will seal over that and be just fine. So it doesn't really hurt the tree at all, but it lets you get a little bit of that sap out of that tree. The best time, or the time that you do maple syrup collecting the sap, is in the winter. These trees, they store up all that energy over the fall. They kind of hold it and get it ready for the springtime, so there's a lot of sap. It's really sweet. It's the sweetest time of year. And so in the winter time, late winter, so in Southern Illinois here, January, February, if you go farther north it gets a little later, but that's when you tap these trees. You put the taps in there, and as the daytime warms up, it gets above freezing in the day, and then cold below freezing at night. That kind of freeze thaw causes that sap to move in these trees. It moves up and down the trees, it moves in and out of the cells, and you're pulling just a little bit of that sap into these spiles and collecting it to make it into maple syrup. One tree like this and one tap can give you about 5 to 10 gallons of sap a year. And so it takes a lot of taps to collect a lot of sap, and it takes a lot of sap to make even a little bit of maple syrup. So on average, you have to collect about 43 or more gallons of sap to be able to turn it into 1 gallon of maple syrup. So it takes a ton, right? You have a little bit of sugar in this sap, and then you get rid of the water by boiling it, getting rid of the water, get the water off there, and it concentrates, and you're getting it thicker and sweeter and thicker and sweeter over that process. And so that's why it takes a ton of sap to turn it into maple syrup. Our season here in Southern Illinois lasts about 7 or 8 weeks. That's about as long as you collect. After that, when it gets too warm, the sap doesn't flow as much, it doesn't taste as good, and so you pull them. So for us, into February, we're pulling these out again and letting the tree kind of seal over those holes. And the next year you can come right back and put more taps right back into this tree. There's people that have tapped the same trees for decades. And again, it doesn't really hurt the tree as long as you only do 1 or 2 taps depending on the size of the tree. This is a pretty big maple tree right here, and you can see we have 2 taps into it. We like sugar maples. Sugar maples have the sweetest sap and the most sap, but even if you have red maples, silver maples, even box elders, which are a maple, any of those trees, as long as they're a maple, produces sap and you can make maple syrup out of it. Though the sugar maple has the sweetest sap generally and the most sap. So that's the one that we prefer. So how do you know you've got a maple tree? So maples have buds and leaves that are opposite, which means there's 2 buds across from each other, or 2 branches or 2 leaves across from each other. And then they have that maple leaf. If you think about the flag of Canada, that's a maple leaf. And so you can see those in the summer, identify your trees. The bark is kind of light tan like this. You may see those little helicopters, the little fruit, the Samara, hanging off of them. That's an easy way to do it as well. But this light tan kind of platy bark like this is where you can help to identify sugar maple. Look for those leaves in the summer. You can even look at the ground below a maple tree. And a lot of times you can find old sugar maple leaves just sitting on the ground. Another easy way to kind of identify it. Make sure you've got a maple, because that's the ones you want to use to tap to make maple syrup. Now we have an experimental forest, like I said, here at Dixon Springs, and we're doing maple syrup collection here to show people how to do it, show people that it can be done here in Southern Illinois. And so our system has a bunch of these tubes, and we actually have about 95 different taps, and they're all running into these little tubes, into the bigger pipes, down into a big tank. That's how we collect our sap. If you're somebody that just has a few trees in your yard and you're interested in making maple syrup, you don't need all of this. You can do those little spiles that you hang a bucket off of, or just one of these that you put a little line of tube down into a bucket. Really easy to collect sap, so it doesn't matter what size of trees, what number of trees you have, 1 tree, 2 trees, or a ton like this. You can collect maple syrup even on a small scale and get just enough for you for those pancakes. We're gonna look at some videos of this system, how we've done it. We're gonna look at boiling the process and all these things. So look for these different videos, little clips coming up next, kind of showing the whole process all the way from tapping the trees down to boiling the sap, finishing the syrup, bottling the syrup.
So what we're doing here is we're starting to put in a first tap of the year, so pretty exciting stuff here. But for these spiles, we have a 5/16 inch drill bit, and we're gonna kind of angle slightly upward so that the sap comes out using gravity. And then we also are looking for the old tap holes, and we're going to try to stay a certain distance away from each of the old tap holes so that the injury can properly heal from the previous holes. So we already selected our site, and I'm going to go ahead. Gonna get it placed in, and then thank you. Just gonna gently tap it with a rubber mallet. So you don't want to do it too hard because that can sometimes actually split the wood, but I think we're ready.
Here we are moving our sap with a tractor. Makes it easier for us. We pick it up in these big tanks and move it from down where our sugar bush is. That's where we collect our maple sap, and up to our boiler. And once we get it up to the boiler, we use pumps to move it out of the tanks and into the boiler this way. it just makes it easier moving things around.
So right here we have our reverse osmosis machine running. In the big tank we have just raw sap straight from the maple trees. And what's happening here is we have a little pump that's pulling the sap. First it goes through a pre-filter. That takes out any little bits of stuff that might have gotten into the sap. And then from there it goes up into each of 4 different canisters here. Each of these have what's called a reverse osmosis membrane inside of them. What's happening is basically the pump is putting the sap under pressure, and it's forcing the sap to go through these membranes. So basically we're reducing the amount of work that we have to do through our evaporation system. So it's more or less it's taking the raw sap and just concentrating the sugars.
So pretty exciting. This is our first time boiling of the year. We over the weekend we got about 25-30 gallons of sap, so a small run. I just wanted to quickly go over and show you kind of our hobby level boiler system here. It's basically a firebox, and we have the stainless steel boiler. It's a 2 foot by 3 foot, again a small one. We wanted to increase efficiency, so we built this little fan blower that just forces air through there, gets it a little more hot. But when you're boiling sap, literally all you're doing is removing the water. You're boiling the water off, and it's concentrating the sugars in there until you get to syrup. But really, maple syrup is just that. It's sap boiled down with the water removed and the sugar concentrated. It's a long process. We're just getting started here in the day, but we're hoping to boil off all of this 35 gallons or 30 gallons or so today, and we'll end up making a couple quarts of wonderful syrup. We boil in the outside in the boiler for a while, but when it gets close, we bring it inside and boil it so we can watch it a little closer, pay attention to it, and so that we don't overboil, and we can make sure to get it just right and hit that perfect maple syrup consistency. So when you're boiling sap, trying to turn it into syrup, the question comes is, how do you know when it's done? And that's actually a really important question, because if you don't boil it long enough and take enough water off, then it may spoil. It's not concentrated enough to be stable. It may go bad. If you boil it too long and it gets too thick and too sweet, it can actually crystallize, and the syrup will actually turn to these hard little kind of sugar rock crystals all in the bottle, and you won't be able to get it out. So it's really important that you hit it just right. And for syrup, that's 67% sugar content. That number is the perfect number to find maple syrup. So how do you know when you've hit that 67% sugar content? We use one of 2 different tools. Both of these are really good. So I'm going to show them to you now. The first is a refractometer. And so a refractometer is just this little tool here, and it actually uses light. As light comes through it, it'll refract or bend the light in different ways depending on how much sugar is in that liquid. So you just lift that flap, you put a couple drops of your syrup there, fold it back over, and then look through it, and there's a scale in there, and it'll show you what sugar content you're in. So it's really accurate and really easy to use. These are nice, good tool to have. The second one we use sometimes is called a hydrometer. And so hydrometers are weighted floats like this, and they're calibrated to sink and float depending on the sugar content in the sap or in the syrup. So the more sugar it is, the higher it floats. And so you use a little canister like this, you fill it full of the syrup or the sap, and then you float this in here, and where it floats, depending on how much sugar content it is and where the top of the sap hits or sugar hits on this scale, will tell you the sugar content of your syrup. And it's another way of accurately getting that number that you need to make it sure that it's maple syrup. Once you've reached that 67%, which is the sugar content that you need for maple syrup, the next thing you do is filter it. So here we are pouring our syrup in through what's called an Orlon filter, and that takes out anything. It might be ash or anything that got into the syrup while you were making it, but also the sugar sand that can get in syrup, which is a natural part of syrup that that you have to filter out to make it good and clear. Once it's filtered, you reheat it up to about 190 to 200 degrees, and then you bottle it. You pour them into these sterilized bottles and seal them off. And once they're sealed, the maple syrup should last fine for a long time. You keep it put up. You don't have to refrigerate it until you open them up. And that is basically how you do this. Again, 40 some gallons of sap, you got to collect it out in the wild, boil it down or concentrate it through the RO machine, filter it, bottle it into sterilized bottles, and your final product is maple syrup. We made here at the Ag Center this year, out of our 90 some taps, right at almost 7 gallons of maple syrup. Not bad. Not a great year. We should be doing more, but we didn't really have as much cold weather as we needed this time around. So one interesting thing about syrup is that it actually can change taste and color a little bit throughout the season. Early syrup, so the stuff right when it starts flowing and kind of the earliest part there of late winter, is going to be light colored. So really light colored. You'll be able to see through it. Like a light amber color, and it's going to be almost vanilla flavored. Really neat. But as it goes on throughout the season, you get closer to the season, it gets darker and darker colored, more red or dark brown, and a stronger maple flavor. So it's kind of neat to see how that changes across the season and kind of figure out what you like best. Me personally, I like the early stuff. I think it's got a wonderful, light, kind of delicate flavor. But a lot of people like that late stuff because it's so strong flavored and really mapley flavored. Either one's great. It's kind of neat to see that and how it changes throughout the season. So that was a quick overview of maple syrup production. Hope it was useful and kind of showed you all the steps involved. We do a lot of different things here at the Ag Center with maple syrup. If you have just a maple tree in your front yard that you want to tap, all it takes is one little spile and a bucket and a way to boil it down. It could even be a pot on your stove. So no matter what scale you want to try maple syrup, you can do it as long as you have a maple tree and some way to get the sap out. It's a lot of fun. It's a great thing to do, and it has very tasty results. Thank you for watching.